When someone suddenly loses interest in you, the most painful part isn't rejection. It's confusion. One day, the energy is there. The messages are warm. The attention feels mutual. And then, without warning, something shifts. Responses slow down. Engagement fades. And you're left trying to understand what changed. Most people assume interest disappears because of something obvious, another person, boredom, or a mistake they made. But in reality, interest rarely disappears suddenly. What feels sudden to you is usually the end of a longer psychological process that you never saw. Interest doesn't operate on logic. It operates on perception. And perception changes quietly, long before behavior does. The first thing to understand is that interest is not sustained by consistency. It's sustained by emotional movement. When emotional movement stops, interest begins to decay, even if nothing bad happens. One of the most common reasons people lose interest is emotional predictability. When someone feels like they already know exactly how you'll react, what you'll say, and how you'll adjust, their brain stops anticipating. And anticipation is the fuel of interest. This doesn't mean you should play games or act distant. It means that when your emotional responses become automatic, your presence stops stimulating curiosity. Curiosity is essential for interest. Without it, connection feels flat. Another major reason interest disappears is over-availability. When someone senses that you are always accessible, emotionally or physically, your value begins to feel unlimited. And psychologically, unlimited availability lowers perceived value. The human mind assigns value to what requires choice, not what is guaranteed. This is where many people misunderstand effort. Effort is attractive when it comes from strength, but effort that comes from fear of loss creates pressure. And pressure suffocates interest. Interest also fades when someone becomes emotionally dependent. Dependency changes the dynamic from desire to responsibility. The moment someone feels they are being relied on to stabilize another person emotionally, attraction begins to erode. Interest does not survive obligation. This is not about being cold or detached. It's about emotional self-regulation. People are drawn to those who can carry their own emotional weight. When you outsource that weight to someone else, they feel it, even if they can't articulate it. Another overlooked factor is identity dilution. Interest is attached to identity, not availability. When you slowly adapt yourself to fit someone else's preferences, you may think you're increasing compatibility. In reality, you're erasing the distinctiveness that created interest in the first place. Interest thrives on contrast, on difference, on the sense that the other person exists independently of your approval. When your identity starts revolving around someone else's reactions, interest weakens. There is also a subtle but powerful shift that happens when someone realizes they no longer have to invest effort to keep you engaged. Effort creates reciprocity. When effort disappears on one side, the other side begins to disengage emotionally, not consciously, but instinctively. This is why people often lose interest right after they feel secured. Not because they are cruel, but because the emotional tension that sustained interest has been resolved. And once tension is gone, interest must find a new source, or it fades. Another reason interest suddenly disappears is unresolved internal conflict. Sometimes the loss of interest has nothing to do with you. People often withdraw when they feel overwhelmed, insecure, or uncertain about themselves. Instead of communicating this, they disengage. But here's the uncomfortable part. Even when it's not your fault, the result feels the same. Interest fades, and trying to pull it back rarely works. One of the biggest mistakes people make at this stage is increasing effort. They explain more. They reassure more. They seek clarity. But clarity seeking often communicates anxiety. And anxiety does not create interest, it repels it. Interest is deeply connected to emotional freedom. When someone feels emotionally free around you, interest grows. When they feel emotionally constrained, interest dies. Even subtle emotional expectations can create that constraint. Another critical moment interest fades is when authenticity shifts into performance. When you start acting in ways you think will preserve interest, instead of being grounded in who you actually are, something changes energetically. The other person senses the incongruence. Humans are highly attuned to emotional alignment. When words, behavior, and internal state don't match, trust weakens. And without trust, interest becomes fragile. Interest also fades when boundaries are unclear. Boundaries create structure. Structure creates safety. And safety allows interest to deepen. When boundaries disappears, the dynamic becomes unstable, and instability eventually leads to disengagement. It's also important to understand that interest doesn't disappear evenly. One person often checks out emotionally long before the other notices. By the time the withdrawal becomes visible, the decision has already been made internally. This is why sudden loss of interest feels so shocking. You're reacting to the final stage of a process that started quietly. There is also a biological layer here. Interest is tied to dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation and anticipation. Dopamine is triggered by uncertainty, progression, and emotional movement. When those disappear, dopamine levels drop, and with them, interest. This is why interest often fades in situations where everything becomes emotionally flat. No conflict, no growth, no progression, just repetition. The brain stops engaging. Another painful truth is that interest often fades when someone realizes they don't feel challenged, emotionally, intellectually, or psychologically. Challenge doesn't mean conflict. It means stimulation, growth, expansion. Interest cannot survive stagnation. One of the hardest lessons to accept is that interest cannot be maintained by force. You cannot convince someone to stay interested. You cannot reason with desire. Interest responds to internal signals, not external pressure. When interest fades, the healthiest response is not to chase it, but to stabilize yourself, to return to emotional independence, to recenter your identity. Sometimes interest returns when pressure disappears. Sometimes it doesn't. But either way, chasing rarely produces the outcome people want. The truth is, people lose interest when they stop feeling emotionally alive in a connection. And emotional aliveness cannot be negotiated. It must be embodied. If someone suddenly loses interest in you, it doesn't automatically mean you are unworthy. It means the dynamic changed. And dynamics can change for many reasons, some within your control, some not. What matters is how you respond. Trying to prove your value often communicates insecurity. Stepping back into yourself communicates stability. And stability is always more attractive than desperation. Interest is not sustained by effort alone. It's sustained by presence, self-regulation, and identity. And the moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep someone else interested, you regain the one thing that actually creates interest: psychological independence.